Cyclones, fire, earthquakes, volcanoes. What happens to animals and even plants in the face of natural disasters? Some can sense the coming catastrophe and flee ahead of time. Others are forced to remain and battle against the odds to stay alive. Indigenous oral history and traditional knowledge is full of stories of nature's resourcefulness. Now, Western scientists are starting to study the ways animals and vegetation cope with the planet's moods and their remarkable strategies for survival. Many have managed to turn adversity to their advantage with some ingenious adaptations. Numerous animals and plants manage to survive and even thrive after catastrophic events. But as the planet warms and the frequency and intensity of fires, floods and cyclones increases, will nature continue to find ways to endure the Earth's wrath? Lying in the Indian Ocean, the island of Sri Lanka is a popular tourist destination, thanks to its stunning scenery, rich marine ecosystems, and its wide range of wildlife. In the south, Yala National Park is home to a variety of mammals, reptiles and birds. On the morning of December the 26th, 2004, tour guides like Thushara Peris had no idea of what they were about to witness.
We didn't see as many animals as usual that day. Normally, between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., we see a lot of animals. But that day, there were not many. They were scared of something, but we couldn't figure out the reason for that.
The animals were aware of something no human could sense. But far away, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded struck off the coast of Indonesia and lasted for a full 10 minutes. Sri Lanka was far enough from the epicenter that the tremor itself couldn't be felt. But the earthquake triggered a series of tsunamis, giant tidal waves, along the coasts of Indonesia, India, Thailand and Sri Lanka, killing over 230,000 people. Fishermen at sea were out of the danger zone, but they too saw changes, as Himapala Leonagi discovered when he returned to his boat in the days following the tsunami.
We went fishing a few days after the tsunami, but the fish that we had seen before the tsunami weren't there. There were no big shoals of fish in the water. Before, we had seen crabs on rocks on the seabed, but they had also gone. We did not see the fish show their usual behavior at all. Even sea creatures like prawns and turtles disappeared during the tsunami and after the tsunami as well.
Many people in Sri Lanka believe that animals were able to sense the impending catastrophe and move out of harm's way. Since ancient times, stories have been told of animals warning humans of impending doom before it happens. Reptiles, geese and dogs have all been credited with saving us from various disasters. But until recently, there had been little scientific study of this phenomenon. Then in 2011, Dr. Martin Wikelski began studying the goats that wander the slopes of Mount Etna in Italy. Towering 3,352 meters above sea level, Mount Etna is the most active volcano in Europe. Most eruptions affect only the vicinity of the crater and pose little danger for locals and their animals. Over 2 years, Dr. Wikelski tagged a number of goats and sheep that live on the volcano's slopes, then kept a close eye on what the animals got up to. Using the data collected, he was able to see how their movements changed depending on the volcano's behavior.
What we saw was that before every major eruption, before every one of those, the goats were showing erratic, strange behavior. They were getting really nervous. But then when you have an eruption coming up, and we don't know what it is, but there's something coming from the earth mantle going towards the surface, and somehow the goats know. And that's really interesting because they are not in one group together. They're distributed around the mountain. And it's a very strong increase in activity. It's not just, wiggling around a little bit or walking around. No, it's a doubling or tripling of activity. And that's quite a massive difference.
Dr. Wikelski knows that the goats act differently before an eruption. Next, he needs to find out how they can tell that something is about to happen.
Well, the truth is, we don't know what it is that the goats experience, what they sense. But it's actually really interesting because we can now, collaborating with the volcanologists, find out where these correlations are. And then we can go out and say, well, could it be smell as the lava, as the magma comes up through the mountain? Is it more the tension in the mountain which they measure? And maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the CO2 that is influencing the plants, that is influencing the goats. But we don't know yet.
Wikelski has recently returned to the slopes of Mount Etna to improve on his first experiments, thanks to sophisticated tags that allow him to track their movements in real time.
So we did studies here before on the goats 6 years ago, studied them for 2 years, but only logged the data, so only wrote them in the memory of the tag. And now we have, for the first time, a real-time system, which is really exciting because now we can determine what the goats are doing when the mountain is going crazy. So from the previous data, we know that the goats are active 4 to 6 hours before a major volcanic eruption, which is really enticing. So within 10 minutes or so, we get the data from these animals and can tell whether they are going crazy or not.
Having confirmed that goats make good volcanologists, Wikelski now hopes to apply his knowledge to other animals.
The next steps are that we go to different parts of the world and ask people which animals are known to tell you something about disasters that are coming. And those will be the animals we tag with the people there and determine whether they are as good as the goats here.
The animals in Sri Lanka and the goats in Italy are not alone in figuring out that something is about to happen before it takes place. And one study has even identified the clues that some animals are picking up on. The OSearch organization was set up to help scientists collect data in the ocean. The deep sea and its many inhabitants remain largely misunderstood due to the difficulty of acquiring hard facts. Despite their high media profile, there is very little concrete information known about even some of the most recognizable animals, such as sharks. Dr. Robert Huter has been tagging various species of sharks for the last 35 years. In 2001, he and his colleague, Dr. Michel Heipel, had marked a group of young black-tipped sharks that were living in shallow water in Tampa Bay, Florida. But on September the 11th, Tropical Storm Gabriel formed in the Gulf of Mexico. 3 days later, it hit the Florida coast with winds of 110 kilometers an hour and heavy rainfall.
We had receivers, acoustic receivers, that were tracking the movements of about a dozen or so young sharks. When the storm approached our coast and we downloaded the data, we saw that these little sharks had left the comfort and the confines and the protection of the nursery area and had gone out somewhere offshore into lower Tampa Bay, perhaps out in the Gulf itself, where they're actually vulnerable to being eaten themselves by larger sharks. What's plotted here in the hashed area is the times when the 13 blacktip sharks left the nursery. But they began to leave with the downturn in barometric pressure and were fully gone even before barometric pressure hit its bottom point.
The sharks reacted to the low pressure associated with hurricanes rather than the wind and rain.
It's actually sensed in the sharks, we now know, in their ears. And yes, sharks do have ears. They have inner ears that can pick up the pressure difference that's associated with depth. Some of the animals reacted very quickly. After this happened, a few others took, an hour or so to kind of make the decision it's time to leave.
20 years after Dr. Huter's first observations, an O-Search team set off on an expedition to Nova Scotia to tag and follow the movements of great white sharks. When they arrived in September 2020, the location was ideal for finding sharks and the weather was beautiful.
But they were clearly gone. They had left. They were avoiding that area and staying offshore.
It seems the sharks had sensed something, and sure enough, shortly after Hurricane Teddy pummeled the Nova Scotia coast, the calm seas of the tagging site were soon transformed by 10-meter waves. From his previous work on black-tipped sharks, Dr. Huter was able to make deductions about the great white sharks in Nova Scotia.
By inference, we conclude that the sharks that could have been there in that very productive place left, rode it out offshore in deeper water, and then when the hurricane effects were pretty much cleaned up, returned, and that's when we found them several days later, a little bit further down the coast.
When the sharks returned, the team was able to catch and tag them. Unlike goats, the shark tagging operation requires a large team of experts and a huge amount of logistics. Using an elevated platform, the shark is towed into place and the specialists set to work. Like a Formula One pit stop, each person on the team is responsible for their task, which they try to perform as quickly as possible to limit the distress to the animal. Samples are taken and the shark is tagged before being sent on its way. Dr. Huter and his colleagues follow 70 great whites in real time and can observe how they react to changing barometric pressure and incoming weather disturbances. While these animals show signs of being able to forecast natural disasters, others are unable to escape from danger. They live in a world where extreme weather events are part of their lives. The island of Puerto Rico lies in the Caribbean Sea, 1,000 miles off the coast of the United States. It's an area of immense natural beauty with its mountains, waterfalls and forests. On the eastern side of the island lies El Yunque tropical rainforest. This area has an average rainfall of 3 meters per year and a highly diverse ecosystem. As well as birds and mammals, the tropical forest is also home to more fragile creatures. Both in the water and on land. Each year, the Caribbean is hit by hurricanes arriving from the Atlantic. Puerto Rico lies right in the path of these huge storms. When hurricanes land, they bring huge amounts of rainfall to the island over very short periods of time. As the water rises, the equivalent of a full year's worth of sediment can be washed into the rivers within the space of a few hours. Rainfall and flooding threaten the forest's tiny inhabitants. These sudden seasonal onslaughts mean even the river's smallest residents have had to look for solutions. The shrimp cope with the rising waters by heading to find shelter or hunkering down. Some shrimp simply avoid the worst impacts of the storm by getting out of the water and walking on land. In fact, very few shrimp die during these events. Many times, they are merely relocated and can even find themselves in the midst of a hurricane-induced smorgasbord surrounded by food. Though they are small, these shrimp eat a huge amount of the plant matter and actually clear the rivers of storm debris. Without these creatures, the streams and waters of Puerto Rico would be completely overwhelmed by organic litter after storms and hurricanes. When a cyclone approaches, fire ants find themselves in a very vulnerable position, faced with rising waters and torrential rain. But they have adapted and come up with a flood drill. Forced to abandon their home, the ant version of Noah's Ark is an incredible feat of survival engineering. The worker ants literally stick together, hanging on to each other by holding tarsi, the insect equivalent of hands. Enough air is trapped on the bodies of the workers around hairs on their legs to prevent them from drowning, and the ants constantly move on the raft, taking turns in various positions. The queen and larvae are protected in the centre, the driest, safest part of this nautical pancake. A fire ant raft can survive for several weeks, drifting with the currents. When the water recedes or they encounter dry land, they swarm to shore and re-establish themselves on new territory. The queen is escorted off the raft and taken to a safe location where the ants will continue the next stage of their lives. The animals of Puerto Rico have found some incredible adaptations in order to survive in their stormy environment. Elsewhere, some species choose to head directly into the danger zone. In North America, Virginia's eastern shore is made up of a series of undeveloped barrier islands. Here, one migratory shorebird stocks up on food before embarking on a momentous journey that has intrigued ornithologists for hundreds of years. Dr. Brian Watts from the Center for Conservation Biology tracks whimbrels and studies their migration.
We had the opportunity to deploy satellite transmitters on birds, and over 10 years we tracked almost 50 birds as they crossed the Atlantic and built up a data set to look at how they interacted with storms.
There are two main populations of whimbrels in North America. The birds look identical and both spend the winter in Brazil. But Dr. Watts discovered that the two groups had found different solutions to the problem of hurricanes.
It turns out that these two populations have different strategies of dealing with the storms. The one, Mackenzie Delta population, basically stays out over cooler water where storms don't form, and so they avoid storms. The Hudson Bay population flies directly across Hurricane Alley, but it does so in a place where there are islands that it can use as ports during a storm. And if they do encounter storms, they'll put down on those islands, wait out the storms, refuel, and then move on to the wintering grounds.
The Mackenzie Delta birds take a massive detour, an epic journey covering 6,000 kilometers non-stop over open water and staying well away from the storm area. The Hudson Bay population takes a shorter route, though it's still several thousand kilometers, heading directly through the danger zone. They set off into the unknown, unable to tell if there are hurricanes approaching. But they have a number of options if they get caught up in storms. If they are confronted with a hurricane, these birds either battle their way against the headwinds or land on one of the many islands in the area. Sometimes they're even rewarded with powerful tailwinds that slingshot them out the other side. By either avoiding storms or risking storm interaction, both populations have adapted to the seasonal dangers, yet their population continues to decline. While he was tracking one particular bird named Goshen, Dr. Watts discovered that the risks were not always weather-related.
Goshen was flying over the West Indies, encountered Hurricane Irene, was put down on Montserrat, and then flew over to Antigua, and was on Antigua for 7 days. And then flew to Guadeloupe and was shot the morning it arrived on Guadeloupe by hunters in a shooting swamp.
Dr. Watts believes that these birds show remarkable resilience in coping with extreme weather conditions, but it remains to be seen if they can survive once they reach dry land. Birds have an amazing ability to adapt to changing conditions, and one species of bird has actually turned a bad situation to its advantage. On the island of New Britain, in Papua New Guinea, 2 volcanoes have been erupting on and off since 1994. The local town, Rabaul, is situated directly in the crater. Many of the town's inhabitants have left to avoid the thick ash and aerial bombardment and find somewhere less geologically lively. It certainly doesn't seem like an ideal location for rearing youngsters, but when the humans left, another creature moved in, choosing this apocalyptic landscape as a nursery for its babies. In forested areas, chicken-sized Polynesian megapod birds bury their eggs in deep nests of decaying vegetation. But around the crater, they lay their eggs up to 2 meters deep in volcanic ash. Egg-laying takes place during calm periods between eruptions. Megapod parents don't incubate their eggs like other bird species. Instead, they leave that job to the volcano itself. Sometimes the megapods brave the disaster zone to return and lay a second or even a third egg. The sparse trees provide little protection from the constant rain of volcanic bombs. In some cases, the stress is too much, and the birds abandon their eggs before they have a chance to bury them. As usual in nature, nothing goes to waste. Megapod eggs have the largest yolk of any birds, making up to 50 to 70% of the egg's weight. Deep in the warm ash, the surviving eggs are kept at a constant temperature. Unlike most other bird species, megapod parents never see their offspring and play no part in raising them. When they finally hatch underground, the young chicks must claw their way to the surface. They emerge fully feathered, with eyes open and ready to fly from day one. It seems like a risky venture, but every year thousands of birds come here to lay their eggs and entrust them to the bowels of the earth. In the face of natural disasters, birds show adaptability and ingenuity. In the north of Australia, certain species of birds have learned to go even further, harnessing the elements with a skill previously thought to be unique to humans. For thousands of years, indigenous tribes in Australia's Northern Territory have managed the landscape by using controlled burns. When burning begins, black kites and other birds of prey arrive from miles around. Known as firebirds, they prey on insects, reptiles and rodents as they escape from the heat. Within minutes of an area catching fire, birds appear as if from nowhere, ready to take advantage of the bounty of food. The blaze creates a feeding frenzy as small animals flee the front line of the fire. Wildlife cinematographer Mark Lamble has worked in the Northern Territory for many years.
The birds would wheel around the fire and then they'd start to swoop down. Some would swoop in front of the fire, and some would swoop behind the fire and pick up dead morsels on the ground of insects and little lizards and small mammals and the odd amphibian, and they would pick them up out of the air, swoop up, grab them, lift them up, and then feed on them.
But in several Aboriginal Dreamtime ceremonies, Indigenous tribes refer to birds flying into bushfires, picking up a burning stick and dropping it elsewhere in order to spread the fire. Mark camped out with Indigenous guides to try and capture this response on film for the first time ever. The Firebirds don't display this behaviour frequently.
On the odd occasion, we saw a bird swoop down and pick something up that wasn't an insect, and that was a firebird picking up a stick.
Bringing Mark one step closer to filming the birds picking up a burning stick and spreading the fire. Now even sceptical Western scientists have started to take Indigenous stories seriously and believe there is compelling evidence that fire starting is not just accidental. But for Mark, there is no doubt about what Indigenous people have known for generations.
I'd heard stories about firebirds for a long time, 30 plus years in the top end. I'd never fully seen it before, but I'd seen the results of it, and when you're driving along and you stop and you might be even filming a fire and suddenly that fire is on the other side of the road and the only thing there to have done it is a bird, you assume it's been a firebird that's picked up a stick and moved that fire.
It seems that the birds only start a new fire when an existing one has reached a barrier and is in danger of going out. The birds appear to want to flush out more prey and understand that fire is the key to this abundant food source. Fires are part of life in Australia, but recent years have seen some of the biggest bushfires in recorded history. Now, the Australian government is showing renewed interest in Indigenous burning practices in the hope of keeping these fires under control. Off the south coast of Australia, Kangaroo Island is well known for its unique ecosystem. But in 2019 and 2020, this wildlife haven was badly affected when bushfires burned more than half of its surface area. On the island and around the world, experts and laymen watch the fires spread, concerned for the future of the endemic species found here. This is an area that is used to fires. The plants and animals here have developed strategies to cope both during the fires themselves and afterwards, once the danger has passed. Renowned environmental physiologist Peggy Rissmiller has discovered that even the smallest animals have developed some surprising behaviours.
The termite species on Kangaroo Island, Nastudotermes exidiosus, is a very special termite that eats timber. And the inside of a termite mound is like a catacomb. And that's formed by the termites eating wood and going in with the wood and the termite spit, forming these catacombs. But then the outside of the mound is actually covered with a soil type from the surrounding areas. And from what we've learned, it looks like the termites actually mine certain minerals and put them over their mound to actually fireproof them, or at least make them more fire retardant.
Termite mounds are not impregnable to fire. Some of them do burn, but they rarely burn all the way underground to where the queen chamber is located. After the passage of the fire, the termites get back to work, rebuilding their empire. Thanks to the termites' inventiveness, another animal has also been saved from the danger of bushfires. Echidnas are found only in Australia. These unusual mammals lay eggs directly inside termite mounds, taking advantage of the termites' fireproofing to protect them. When threatened by fires, echidnas go into a type of hibernation known as torpor.
They'll dig in, they'll get soil between their spines, and that causes them to have sort of an insulation. They also have the unique ability to lower their metabolism, their respiration, their heartbeat, and they can survive things like fire, even when some of their spines might get melted by the heat of the fire.
This period of torpor allows them to conserve energy while they wait out the danger. In fact, Peggy Rissmiller has discovered that the ecology of Kangaroo Island is not unique.
All the species all over Australia have evolved with fire. For the most part, the species are very good at surviving fires and have their own methods for doing that.
Eucalyptus trees are native to Australia and are found throughout the island. They contain an oil that is highly flammable, not ideal in an area where fires are a regular occurrence. Each year, the trees shed their bark and leaves, creating huge piles of combustible fuel on the ground. When a bushfire passes through, this tinder burns quickly. The trees may lose leaves and branches, but the fire moves rapidly, so the trunk and roots are usually spared. In fact, some eucalyptus trees depend on fire to reproduce. Eucalyptus seeds are contained in hard seed pods that are sealed with resin. These cones can only release their seeds when the heat of a fire has melted through this protective case. The seeds then fall onto a nutrient-rich bed of ash where all competitive plants have been cleared out, creating an ideal area for young trees to regrow. Small orange funguses appear on the ground directly after the fire. They have a crucial role, helping to change the soil pH after it has been alkalized by fire. Browsing animals are temporarily driven out, and the heated soil reduces the number of plant-eating insects and soil organisms during the important early growth period. Eucalyptus trees produce new growth which sprouts directly from the base of the tree. The stress of fire causes epicormic buds to shoot directly from the tree's branches and trunk. Even if the leaves of the tree have been burnt, these buds sprout and produce new foliage, allowing it to survive. Eucalyptus is not the only fire-dependent tree on the island.
Some of the vegetation on Kangaroo Island is quite incredible because it actually needs fire in order to germinate. So when the fire came and a lot of the plants actually threw open their seed pods and seeds were scattered everywhere.
Various tree species need fire and extreme heat to propagate their seeds. Fire is a positive force, bringing renewal and even resources to other species.
Now that's when also after the fire we saw a lot of different bird species come in and feed on those seeds. Some of the plants which came back quickly are only here, and that's one of the astonishing things about Kangaroo Island.
Grass trees, or xanthorrhea, are one of these endemic species. They are extremely slow-growing, and some of the tallest species are estimated to be more than 400 years old. And yet, during that time, they must have outlived numerous bushfires. A fire may burn their leaves and blacken their trunks, but the trees usually survive. In fact, their growth point is buried underground, protected by tightly packed leaf bases, away from the inferno above. Some grass trees are even stimulated by fire to flower.
So the xanthorrhea actually needs fire in order to make its beautiful flower stalks. And those flower stalks are important for food, for the nectar feeders, such as the pygmy possums and a lot of our birds.
Spear-like flowers, growing up to 4 meters long, appear as a result of this outwardly destructive event. The fires seem to be catastrophic, but nature demonstrates its creativity both during the event and afterwards.
We did not lose any species, and it is amazing how resilient our wildlife is when it comes to surviving fire.
A period of plenty can even follow in the aftermath of a disaster, a phenomenon that is not limited to Kangaroo Island. The country of Nepal lies on a fault separating two tectonic plates. As one plate slides under another, pressure builds up and can be released in the form of an earthquake. Even a medium-sized quake can devastate vast areas and kill thousands. Whole towns are razed to the ground, but quakes also cause mudslides, bringing the country to a standstill. However, one part of the population takes this kind of disaster in its stride. Never at a loss for inspiration, monkeys are ready to take advantage of the situation. In Nepal, rhesus macaques are protected and flourish in the jungles around the city. They are regarded as holy animals by Buddhists and Hindus, but they are considered pests by the local farmers. Having adapted to the influx of humans in the area, they are known for raiding crops, a low-effort, high-benefit way of sourcing food. After a recent earthquake in Nepal, troops of macaques continued this behavior in urban settings, where they headed into towns and rummaged through the rubble to find food. These freeloaders don't let catastrophic quakes stand in their way. For them, the tremor has merely created a new opportunity. Macaques are one of the most successful primate species on the planet after humans. To take what they want and escape quickly, they have developed pouches in their cheeks that let them store food while they transport it so they can eat it later. These macaques are also not restricted to one type of food. They can adapt to the resources available, putting them in a much better situation when disasters hit and destroy their habitual food sources. Switching food sources and the ability to store food or fat are essential for thriving after a cataclysm. Having escaped the mass extinction of its dinosaur ancestors, one common bird continues to demonstrate its ability to survive. Kauai is one of the largest of the Hawaiian Islands. It is covered in tropical forest, high mountains, crystal clear rivers, and sandy beaches. But despite its idyllic appearance, the island is sometimes hit by storms, with unexpected results.
In '92, at the same time they filmed that movie Jurassic Park, a hurricane came through called Aniki. And Aniki blew these chickens into the air and they wound up, you know, landing wherever and starting new families and stuff. And before Aniki, there was no chickens around. But since that one storm in '92, it's infestation of chickens.
In Steven Spielberg's film, a huge storm allowed marauding, bloodthirsty dinosaurs to break free and terrorize the island, while in real life, Hurricane Aniki allowed the island's domesticated chicken population to fly the coop and live according to their whims. But they're not the first birds to find freedom on this island. Red jungle fowl, brought by the first Polynesians, had already made their home in Kauai's mountains. The freed domesticated chickens and wild jungle fowl interbred to form a whole new breed of chicken, the feral chickens of Kauai. An entire population of domestic animals returning to the wild is a highly unusual occurrence. But the feral chickens have grabbed the opportunity with both feet and have adapted very quickly to the urban environment of the island. And most of the locals seem happy to share the island with their feathered neighbours.
And no matter where you go, if you go back up into the mountains and in the jungle, there's chickens there. And if you go everywhere, you go to Walmart, there'll be chickens.
On the island, this new breed of chickens is equally at home in the jungle and the city. Biologist Eben Gehring and his colleagues have come to Kauai to study this unusual bird population.
Don't worry, there's space for you in there. Why Kauai makes a great natural lab for our studies is that we have a historical context for when these populations began exchanging genes. So we know about how many generations have elapsed since those storm events. And since this population underwent an exponential increase in the size, the number of individuals.
Now, in this case, we have domestic birds that we've kind of now gone back into natural conditions. They've been breeding with the native red jungle fowls. So you have a process known as fertilization, whereby a domestic population suddenly has to reacclimatize, has to adjust to these more natural conditions.
So has this led to a chicken population explosion? Even the experts can only guess.
You can see that, the number of birds has dramatically increased in the island, but it's very, very hard to get a truly accurate population census. If I was forced to estimate maybe 10,000?
People are going to say 10,000 and some are going to say 1 million. My guess would be somewhere in between those numbers.
However many chickens there actually are, the birds, like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, were able to take advantage of a major meteorological event and make a bid for freedom. Returned to the wild, it seems they'll remain free for the foreseeable future. Recent years have seen a marked increase in natural disasters around the world. Experts predict that global warming will lead to rising sea levels, supercharged storms, prolonged droughts, and heavier precipitation. On Kangaroo Island in Australia, Peggy Rissmiller believes that increased lightning strikes will cause more fires in the island's future.
How that will affect the ecosystem will be really interesting because fire is natural and fire has not devastated the ecosystems, but it has changed ecosystems. And I think with global warming and with more fires, the ecosystems will survive, and it'll be interesting to see what adaptations happen, but they'll certainly be here in the future.
Life on Kangaroo Island has evolved over millions of years to cope with fires, but it remains to be seen if nature elsewhere will be able to cope with a sudden change in the climate. Certainly, humans have a lot to learn from the natural world as our planet changes. If we look closely at how nature has adapted, we can take inspiration from examples of survivors' resilience and successes.